Good evening and welcome to the real history of photography. Okay, so I've posted a few micro blogs before, and I've done a little bit of chatter on some videos I posted about the real history of photography and what that might actually look like. Like most people, I suppose, when I got into photography, I was really into things like David Bailey, Richard Avedon, Ansel Adams, stuff which is more kind of like modern, or not modern now, but modern in photography terms. And looking back at those, like 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that was kind of like where my real inspirations were when I first started out. So when I first got into photography, I wasn't really interested in the history of photography as such. I was into things like David Bailey for fashion, Richard Avedon. I got into other areas as my kind of career got going, but really 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that kind of period was kind of like, probably still is the most iconic period of photography, and the people that seem to have got or had the most influence on modern photographers. So looking back at further back in history of photography, it wasn't really on my radar. It was only when I started doing my master's degree in 2015, 16, 17 that I even really started looking past tense at photography and where some more of its origins may have been. And that only really came from looking at photographers like Stieglitz, Ansel Adams, some of the more kind of like what you might call creative art photographers, those guys who were doing real good work, real high quality work, but were probably only known in photography circles. Ansel Adams was a bit more famous and widely known. So I'd not really delved into the history of photography that much. I was kind of like hooked, like most people are, on the ones who were really famous and the ones that you know. So it took me a little while to kind of branch out from that. But what I've noticed in life is that quite often, always, history is written by people who don't really want you to know the truth. They want you to know their version of the truth. And as I started looking into past photography and photography origins, if you like, I started to notice that a lot of what was being passed off as key information or true information was actually opinion and wasn't information at all. So as I began to look back and find inspirations, particularly in with Stieglitz and his equivalent series, just the simplicity of it, the more I realised around that time that the art world absolutely shunned photography. The art world was never going to accept photography as an art form, and doesn't really to this day. The fact that it took millions of years to get David Bailey into the portrait gallery is kind of testament to the fact that artists won't accept photography as being an art form. It's just a couple of buttons you push. It's a mechanical process. It's not an art form. You know, and I do. Any photographer worth salt knows that photography is the ultimate art form. When you've mastered photography and you understand its capabilities, I don't think there's many, if any, better art forms out there. That includes music, painting, performance. I would stand photography above all them in terms of an art form. So just waffling about on this intro, trying to get into the headspace as to where I was when I first started looking into the actual history of photography that's taught, and more as I looked at it, I started branching into, that was never taught to me. Why have I never come across that before? And it seemed to me that whilst I was researching stuff 2015, 16, 17, and then post-master's degree, when I started writing academic papers and onto a book, it felt like things were being written as I was reading them. Wedgwood started to appear quite a lot. Fox Talbot became more prominent, and it was almost as if Wikipedia was reading my mind. It was like the people who edit Wikipedia and more wider edit our history started to put more and more photographic history in to our sphere, because I think more and more people were starting to question the origins. And as I discovered whilst I was researching this, that by no means am I the first person to say, hang on a minute, pretty sure that's not right, pretty sure that doesn't feel right, sure that photography must go back further than that. And I found a whole bunch of people who had the same sentiment and who had done their own research, and I built on that. So I'm quite happy to admit a little bit of standing on the shoulder of giants as I went along. But I think I took my research in down slightly different avenues to what they did. Most people, particularly academic researchers or mainstream researchers, are a little bit fearful of being cancelled, because they have incomes, they have, status to maintain. So quite often researchers push a line but don't push it any further. Well, I didn't really have anything to lose in that respect. I've never really cared what people think about me. I've always tried to tell the truth. Whether that's right, wrong or indifferent, I just think if you're going to tell somebody a story, particularly about their history, then tell them the truth, or tell them the truth as you see it and find it. So that's what I did. And I became a little bit estranged from academia during that period. I found it difficult to get on board with their thinking and their dismissance of certain things, and hopefully you'll go buy the book at some point, The Obfuscation of Photography, and reading that, and I kind of explain at some length why I distance myself from academia, even though it's written in an academic way, utilising references. I do talk in there about what my relationship with academia became, having looked in depth at the real history of photography, and not just photography, because the book branches into other areas of life, because photography didn't exist in a void, it never did. So what I'm going to do for this podcast is I'm just going to briefly go through some points in my book to kind of help generally people understand that the history of photography is not what it is pretended to be in the history books, in Wikipedia, and in all those libraries up and down the land that tell you that it was invented in the early 1800s by a French guy called Niepce. In my eyes, that period was more of a remembering of photography rather than an invention of, but we'll get to that. So I'm going to start with a little bit more about realisation, and then I'm going to go through the list of chapters, but I'm going to be very brief just to give you an overview of how I came to my conclusions. For those of you that don't know me, you may be surprised that some of this will go into quite esoteric areas, as they say. For me, saying something is esoteric is just a lazy way of saying I can't be asked to research it myself. So I'm just going to dismiss it as being esoteric. So if you're not keen on left field ideas or even left field truths, best to unplug now, because that's where we're going. So the reason I wrote a book was, didn't intend to write a book initially. What I'd done is in 2018, when I completed my master's degree, there was a little bit of void in thinking for me, and I wanted to carry on that way of thinking, what some people might call high level academia. I just call it thinking. And because I'm a photographer, I'm notoriously lazy. I need kind of a deadline to aim for, or a thing to aim for. So what I did is I decided, now I've done a master's degree, the next step is a PhD. And to bridge that gap, I thought, I'll start to write some academic work, try and get it published, to kind of ready myself to go to that next level of PhD. And I'm really glad that I did that, because it did two things to me. It made me realise I can write to that level, can research to that expected level. But it also made me realise just how tunnel visioned PhD thinking is. And what writing the academic paper did for me was completely turn me off the idea of ever wasting my time doing that again. And hopefully I'll cover some of that during this podcast, and it's certainly in the book. You might notice I try to sell the book a little bit as we do this. But that's what happened. So I'm entirely glad that I wrote the paper. So the academic paper that I wrote in 2018 was, I titled it The Death of the Mechanical Photograph. And in researching themes for my master's degree and in just talking about photography in general with people and seeing what was happening, particularly I was teaching creative media at the time, and I was seeing a lot of AI headset stuff coming. And I don't mean AI like the AI we have now, but it was more like people just immersed in fake realities and in how they can escape their lives into these realities. And my original thinking was, my God, in, I don't know, 10 or 20 years' time, people won't even want to be in reality because they'll be so immersed in these fake realities that they'll not come out of them. And then I thought, they'll not have a need for photography because these headsets and these virtual realities are so good now. You could go in and you can replay it and you can freeze frame anywhere you want in that game, that film, that experience, and get a photograph. So nobody will need a camera. So that was where the thinking for that paper came from. But also, you may discover this as we go through podcasts and the other things I do, that I'm a big proponent of the holographic universe. And if you don't know what that is, it's a theory that we don't live in a reality that we think we do. We don't live in a solid reality. Everything we live in is holographic, and this experience just cons us into believing that things are solid. And a lot of mainstream science over the last 10 years has started to agree with that theory. And when you get into quantum mechanics and that kind of stuff, things in life tend to make a bit more sense when you look at it from that point of view. So my kind of thinking is kind of firmly wedged in a holographic reality simulation idea. That doesn't mean that you can treat people like shit and act like a plank. You know, we're in a reality. We live in this reality. We must look after each other. Absolutely. But I see it in a slightly different way, I think, to many people. I'm not the only person who's had these ideas and these thoughts. Many people out there have written about holographic existence for a long time. And if you go back, way back in history, thousands of years, to the early religions such as the Gnostics, it's basically that's what the Gnostics say we are. We come from thought patterns. So none of that's new, but it's something I've thought about for a long time. And whilst I was researching the paper and the virtual reality idea, I started to link the two together, and I started to realise that more and more people were trying to get back to their roots of spirituality and understanding of our reality. And my kind of thinking was, the end of photography will come about because people will either retreat into their natural habitat, the natural reality, the natural experience, taking things like ayahuasca, which is it's seen as a mind-bending drug, but I think really it's a alternative universe opening drug. Or they'll sink into virtual reality, which is made by, I don't know, the usual suspects. Sir Gates, Zuckerberg, Mr. Musk, and all those other philanthropists, what there was, who suck people into that metaverse, whilst others, realising what that means for them, retreat into who knows where to escape. And my conclusion was that whichever happens, the need for a mechanical photograph, a camera or device to take a photograph will be no more within 40 years. And as I've said in another video, that was before the onslaught of AI that we're having inflicted on us currently. And if I had known that, I probably would have said 5 years. But as things stand with the book, the academic paper that I wrote, prelude to the book, my conclusion was that photography would not exist in 40 years. So I thought at that point we've got 40 years to save photography. Turns out we've probably got 5. So once I'd finished writing that paper, I thought, I think I'd come across enough material and some interesting things around the history of photography. Basically, the fact that there's very little evidence for the 1826 founding of photography. I thought, maybe I'll write another paper, and this time I'll go and investigate the history of photography. Seeing as I'm concluding that it's going to be over in 40 years, why not go backwards and write about its origins? So that was initially what I started to do. And I acknowledge that at the start of the book, about realization and what I was trying to achieve at that point. And it was interesting that before too long, I discovered that the given history of photography, the accepted 19th, stuck on the 19th, the accepted 1826 to 27, not quite sure when, invention of photography by Niepce, closely followed by Mr. Daguerre, who is then more famous for more widely producing it, making it, inventing it, giving it to the world. The history for all that is very, very thin. And if I had my teaching hat on or my lecturing hat on, and a student gave me the history of photography that you can find for that version of the history of photography as an essay with proofs taken from what you could find that I found, I would be making them go and think about it again, and write it again, because there is not much in the way of absolute proof. And you could argue, I guess, that we're looking at way back in history, although it's only a few hundred years. We've got the Magna Carta, for Christ's sake. We've got, all those other wondrous things that are found in Egypt that we take as given as being real. Cuneiform tablets and the like, and papyrus, parchment things that are found in caves that we're told to believe as truth. But photography, very little. And quite early on in the research for the second paper, I thought there's too much here for a paper. This is going to have to be a book. And when you consider I'm not an author, I don't claim to be an author. I never authored anything in my life other than an essay to get a qualification, and some songs back in the day, which I thought I was quite good at that as well. Writing this book kind of opened my eyes to the reality of academia and how it's a stone wall, a brick wall, a void for real research, for real proofs, and for something new. How the human race moved forward and trusted anything to academia is beyond me. And I'll talk about that later on, and you can certainly read my thoughts in the book. But the paper became a book, and the book, although I think it's about 133 pages plus the bibliography, which is about another 10. 133 pages, which is not a big book. This is not a Stephen King novel or even an encyclopedia on photography. It's just my brief understanding of what I gleaned looking back to try and find the origins of where I think photography actually came from. And there are hints to where it came from, I think, in the actual lie that we've been sold for the last few hundred years. A lot of things are talked about and speculated about and hinted at, but never really talked about. And the simpler things for you to consider are things like in the early 1800s, when Frenchman Niepce was trying to figure out how to make a photograph, he was using something called Bitumen of Judea, which is, if you don't know what bitumen, it's basically tar. It's the same stuff that they stick on the road to make it all stick together. And tar, when it's, bitumen, when it's left in light, will go off. So an example might be, if you get some bitumen and paint it on something, I don't know, put something like this on top of it, leave it to dry for days, take that away, you'll get an imprint where the bitumen's dried, where the light's been, and hasn't where it hasn't been. And that was the kind of process that Niepce was using in the 1800s. So the first thing I did was research where that kind of idea came from. And what I discovered was that actually bitumen of Judea has been used for many things. One of the things was embalming. So Egyptians and earlier were using bitumen to embalm bodies because of the properties it had. And we're talking about 3,000 years. Excuse the clicking on the keyboard. I'm just searching my document just to refresh my memory. The Bitumen of Judea, it's been known about, its light properties were known about 3,000 years ago. So if you think about that just for a minute, so 3,000 years ago, maybe 3,500 years ago, people around the world knew that bitumen had light saving qualities, and it took 3,000 years or so for a guy in a little French village to go, I wonder if I paint that on a bit of metal and stick it out my window with a pinhole, and it'll draw a picture for me. So I started thinking, you know, that's a long expanse of time to have light saving property material to the camera. So I looked at what else was going off 3.5 years ago, and there's all sorts of wondrous things that were going off then, as you might know, because some of these things do bleed through into history. But really, what my kind of like instinct was, I was looking for other things that could be aligned with photography or photographic processes. So I was looking for things like glass. So how old was glass? And I was thinking of glass because that's what was used in early photography, glass plates. And sure enough, almost off the bat, I find glass from a similar time period. So glass is naturally occurring, by the way. You know, extreme heat will cause glass. But mainstream academia would admit that glass has been artificially manufactured since 5000 BC. So 5000 BC, similar time to bitumen of Judea, glass and bitumen. Got a couple of components there for photography. But glass can be used for multiple things, so it can also be used as a lens. So I'm thinking, lens. How far back can we find a lens? So again, according to academia, first accepted reference for the use of a lens was in a play by Aristophanes in 423 AD. So again, 2,500 years ago, we've got lenses mentioned. So we've got bitumen of Judea, we've got glass, we've got lenses. And that's a lot of time, I think, for people who were very clever. We're talking about a time when philosophers were rife, when all sorts of things were going down around the world, and nobody thought to combine those things until some Frenchman happened upon it in the 1800s. So I kept digging, and I was coming forward a little bit, and I found out that, you know, that again, glasses that we use, spectacles, when you consider we've got glass and the use of lenses 3,500 years ago, that the first glasses weren't used until 1290 in Italy. I think that's a little strange as well. And I'll get onto why I think things are like that a little later on. But putting these things together, I'm starting to think things being hidden here, things not quite right. And then I came across a book by what people of the time might call a kook, or a magician, or a wizard, or a witch, or a con man. And when you read this book, which is called Natural Magik, and it's by a guy who you would call a scholar and a polymath, Giambattista della Porta, his name is, if I've said that right. The book Natural Magik, the more I got into it, the more it became quite obvious to me that it was a manual for photography. And this is 1585. So that's 250 years or so before photography was invented. And I think because there's a little bit of a language issue, translations and whatnot over the years, but you know, the old Greek, Latin thing. But I think also around, because people that were intelligent that had all these ideas and concepts were kind of sometimes seen as bad and kooks and lunatics, they wrote their things in code. So Giambattista della Porta, in his book Natural Magik, talks quite openly, I think, considering about the use of photography. And there are lots of other people around at that time, Kepler, Newton, all the usual suspects. But I think within all that, most of those were what I call gatekeepers, or didn't exist at all. It's quite possible that quite a few people in history were more than one person merged into one, and or didn't exist at all and were just fabricated. And I think some of those around that time were. But the book Natural Magik explains for people who can't paint, people who can't do art, how using light, a pinhole, and some chemicals can make a lifelike picture. And when you read that and strip it down, it's quite clear that he's talking about photography. So I'm really starting to get into the depths of where photography might have its origins, and that kind of took me down a real road I wasn't expecting. And I kind of say in my book that I don't want to get into religious areas, but in the research it became obvious to me that the Shroud of Turin is actually a photograph, and I'll get into that a little bit more now. So we're talking about something called Proto photography. I didn't coin that phrase. That's a phrase that was coined by other people who are much more intelligent than me. But some researchers were wanting to prove or disprove what the Shroud of Turin was. If you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, it's a length of linen cloth that bears a picture of somebody, and people believe it to be that of Jesus Christ and or the biblical Jesus, and And like I said in the book, I don't want to get into religious debates. I'm not here to talk about religion. What I wanted to see was whether that could be a photograph or not. So one of the main reasons given by academia for it not being a photograph of Jesus. Some people, by the way, think that it's what's his name, playing a medieval trick or a Renaissance trick. That bugger that invents everything and paints everything. Mona Lisa guy, name escaped me. That it's actually him. And I think some of that is just to throw a bit more doubt, a bit more confusion into the equation. But cutting a longer story short, a couple of researchers discovered that it's entirely possible to make a photograph using the exact same stuff that was found in the Shroud. So Professor Lynn Pickett and Clive Prince, so Lynn Pickett and Clive Prince, along with Professor Allen, had done their own experiments to replicate the Shroud, and had succeeded in doing so using stuff that was available in the said time period. And the main thing, Leonardo da Vinci, that's him, Da Vinci, the man from everything. When they decided that it couldn't be the photograph of Jesus or anything to do with Jesus because of the timing, that took me into an even weirder kind of space, because I stumbled across then at the same time a Russian researcher called whose name his first name I can never pronounce, and I want to say Anthony Fomenko, who's kind of looked at what we call the Scalarian timeline. I'll get into that in a sec. And he's basically threw a spanner in the works and said that there's been 1,000 years of history added to our timeline, and 1,000 years of Dark Ages or medieval period didn't actually exist. So when you do the maths and take that out and look at the timing, the supposed date of the Shroud of Turin, taking away that 1,000 years of added history, it becomes perfectly plausible that somebody called Jesus, who would have lived around that time, could have been photographed. Now you can imagine the implications of that, can't you? That the Shroud of Turin is actually a photograph of Jesus or somebody called Jesus, and all the implications that come out of that, good, bad and indifferent. So it will never be allowed, even if that is true, it would never be allowed to be told and given as a truth, because you can imagine, can't you? And one of my theories for the obfuscation of photography, the hiding of photography, is how many truths in history can be erased if you don't have true photographs of them. And if photography is in our existence for the whole time, and there are pictures, to hide them is the best way of people never knowing real truths. So the Shroud of Turin is one of those things that is going to be highly contentious, but from their research and mine, they discovered that it could be a photograph of somebody from that time period. If we follow Fomenko's idea that we've had 1,000 years of extra time added in to suit narratives, if we take that off, it's quite possible that around that time somebody called Jesus could have been photographed. And we're not talking about photographs like me and you taking them. We're talking about long weeks, days, sometimes months worth of exposure. But the process was there in that time. So, of course, academics absolutely destroyed those guys and, brushed it off as hearsay, mad science. But I thought, if they've done that, I might have a go at that. So I did, but before I did that, while I was researching, I'd stumbled across this book by David Hockney. Maybe you can see that. It's a great book. Secret Knowledge. And it still astounds me to this day that he actually got that published. He got people on board with that, a publisher. He even made a TV series about it, or a short documentary which you can get on YouTube called Secret Knowledge, same. And it's about David Hockney's, I guess, a gut feeling. How he stumbled on it, I don't know. But it's similar to me that something was wrong with history. And the easiest way to explain it is he'd noticed that almost overnight painters went from being good to photographic good, kind of in historical terms overnight. And he'd always argued that there must have been a camera involved, there must be photography involved. And mainstream academics said, well, David, if that was true, where's the cameras? Why are there no cameras? There'd be cameras everywhere if that was true. And that's one of the things that's wrong with academia. To have photographs, you have to have a camera. Well, you don't. And the reason you don't is because you look at a pinhole camera or a camera obscura. Thousands and thousands of years. In fact, in the early research I did, even some academics were saying that camera obscura, a pinhole letting light into a wall, was the inspiration for quite a lot of cave paintings. And that's in my book. It's researched and documented in the book. And if you bring that forward, we can make a photograph today without a camera. So for an academic to say they could never have used cameras in the medieval period because there'd be bits of camera lying around is ridiculous. But anyway, so to prove his theory right, Hockney went and started investigating. And what Hockney and his friend found was that there was something called concave and convex mirrors, which were understood and made to the highest order, to the highest quality, way back in the 1400s, I want to say. And once you realise that there are convex and concave mirrors, it kind of opens up a lot of possibilities. And what David Hockney found was that he could make a photograph, or rather a picture, just by using a mirror. And I've spoke about this in other blogs that I've done, where I've got a concave mirror and held it against the wall, and the reflection coming in bounces off the mirror and creates a photograph shape on the wall, very clear picture. And what Hockney realised was that this is what happened. The painters had gone from what he calls eyeballing, doing everything by eye, to suddenly having something to map and trace. So when you look at the examples he gives, I'm not going to show them here because there's copyright issues and whatnot. But in 1553, for example, there's a Marini photograph a Marini painting that looks like a photograph. It has lens distortions, converging lines, got depth of field, and realistic detail. That's in 1533, and in 1306-ish, the Giotto that he's discussing is flat and quite obviously eyeballed and painted from a different reference. So he kind of quite clearly links that painters went from naturally painting using their eye to using what he calls a mirror lens, concave lens, to record. And you can see that. If you go watch the documentary, or buy the book's expensive, so maybe not buy the book, but go and watch the documentary and you can see for yourself. They definitely started using lenses. So they were using lenses to create pictures. And Hockney, 100% Hockney proved that. And if you, like I say, if you look at his research, it's a bit of an eye. You can see for yourself, wow, light and day, absolutely light and day, that something changed. And he believes it happened around 1420, 1430, which is 14, 15, 16, 17. 400 years before what academics and mainstream academics call the invention of photography. Now, it might be rudimentary photography, but it's still photography, and I've proven it actually works. So I went a little step further than Hockney, and I did a few experiments of my own, and I used Bitumen of Judea, I used a concave mirror, and I used some glass. You can see some glass here with some smudge on it. That's a photograph. It's hard to see there, but you can see them in the book. I don't know how much you can see of that. You can see the distortions on it. And there's a tin plate here, which is one of the ones that I scanned in the book. And a real dark one here that took a little bit of getting to. But again, when you scan it in and you bring them up, you can see them. You can see the photographs on them. And that was just me in my shed doing days and weeks of exposure onto bitumen and using all sorts of other stuff to wash the bitumen off. And it's all there in the book. And but I basically proved the rudimentary camera. And in the end, I built a box again, which is in the book. And I'll show you on the video when I edit this. A box, basically just a 1 foot square box with a mirror in it, with a hole for the light to come through, hits the mirror, bounced onto a piece of photographic paper, left it for days, burnt the photograph in it. So all the ingredients are there for me, for proto photography to have existed in my head for thousands of years, probably since people could do that and realise that. And we talk about, we've got no idea how the pyramids were built, why they were built. There's loads and loads of various ideas. But the fact is somebody did it. It was done. So to say that people of the same time couldn't invent a camera is just arrogance. It's just arrogance on the part of academia. And I think, like I alluded to with the Shroud of Turin example, that people would want to hide photography because a history with photographic evidence is not as easy to hide, obscure, and change. And you might say, so how come then they're allowed to invent photography in the 1800s? What changed them? What made them allowed to carry on? And I think in the book I go into a bit more detail about how I think history is. There's big changes happen. Every few hundred years we get something called a reset, and we're about due one. And for want of a better phrase, everything stops and everything starts again. And on this last reset, late 1700s, early 1800s, photography was kind of around, it was picked up, and it got out before people could contain it, I think is the way to say it. And by the time it was out and had gone through a few people, it was just available, and it was just there, and it was too late to stop it. I think there've been various attempts to stop it. I think that's why there's no history. If you look from the 1800s to now, we'll try and find real in-depth information and history about the mainstream history of photography. It's not there. There are lots of hearsays, maybes, possiblies from the 1900s, 1950s, but when you go back in time, there's not a lot there. So there are some other things within that. I mean, Hockney doesn't say that photography existed. He says that they used reflections, lenses, as an aid to painting. And I go one step further and I say that I actually think quite a lot of the Renaissance paintings were in fact photographs that have either been painted over to obscure them or are still in fact proto photographs. And an example of that is because our friend Mr. DiCaprio then, Leonardo da Vinci, supposedly invented, Leonardo da Vinci, supposedly invented this process called Sfumato. Can't even find him in my text. He's another famous polymath. There's another one of those guys from history that can do everything. Did he exist? Possibly. Do I think he existed? Probably not. Probably a handful of different people written into history to make us all go, oh wow, wasn't he amazing? So he invented this process called Sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O. And this is it's a painting process believed to have been invented by Da Vinci to create paint strokes at just 0.025 millimeters. That's 25 micrometers. That's, if you compare that to a human hair, which is something like 17 micrometers to 181 micrometers, Da Vinci, 500 years ago, invented this chemical technique, paint, that was that small, you couldn't see it. They supposedly didn't have microscopes, etc. then. But he'd somehow figure this paint process out using brushes and his fingers. And when it's being investigated by modern day techniques, micro technology, that we're talking about layers of paint that's stacked on top of each other, dozens of layers of paint that are thinner than a human hair. I think that's a print process. I think whatever that is a print process, and it's just passed off as a painting process because we can't do it now. Like all those things, stonemasons can't do it now because it's too expensive, it's a lost art. It's another one of those things. Nobody, even in 300, 400 years, has been able to replicate this Sfumato thing. And I think because it's print, it's a print process, or it's a chemical process. The chemicals are laid out a little bit like Porta says in his practical magic book. You lay the colours out, you let the light fall on them, you get a picture. So if you can't paint, that's the process to use. But I don't think that mainstream academia would ever admit that Da Vinci made photographs, not paintings. And it's strange that the word sfumato only appears in text from around 1801, which is hundreds of years after Da Vinci's time. So if he invented this word, this process, why does it not appear in literature, regular appearance in literature until the 1830s? What happened to it in the hundreds of years in between? People forget about it? I would say it's because it's a process that's been made up by academia to cover up the fact that it's actually a photograph, not a painting. So where David Hockney rightly explains that photography, proto-photography, was in use as an aid to painting, my research took me one step further and suggested that actually many paintings from the Renaissance period are photographs, not paintings. And the book goes into a lot more detail as to why. And then from that all that research led me into many other areas, and in particular, what I call pseudo characters and things that didn't happen, and that in turn led me to the idea that every few hundred years there's some kind of catastrophe and things are reset and we go from scratch. We're told it's the Industrial Revolution. When you look at it in isolation, suddenly magical, wondrous machines appear. Magical, wondrous people appear. And I go into it in some detail in the book, but next time you've got 5 minutes, just have a look at the random stuff that happened in the 1800s. And you'd be surprised how many things just appear out of nowhere. Things that are already developed and are there, ready to be used, but we don't seem to understand why. I'm not going to get into that in depth in this podcast because it's a bit left field. It's not really about photography, but if you look at it, it's in there. So my kind of research meanders a little bit then and goes off piece, and we go into the wider stolen history, the theft of history, and why that might be. And dating photographs was another thing that I came across. Even today, it's impossible to date photographs. People think that you've got a photograph that's taken on a digital camera, it's got a timestamp on it, it's got a metadata. That's all changeable. Programs out there you can change that with. I bought my new camera, which is filming me there, my R6, and I took it to New York, and I didn't change the time date on it. So because we're 6 hours in front, everything is out of sync. But if you didn't know that, you'd assume I took the pictures at a different time and day. And you find that when you're looking back through photographs, even if somebody has the presence of mind to write on the back of the print where it was taken, when, all that could be lying. So dating photographs is almost impossible. Even if you've got a handful of witnesses, it's quite impossible to date. So I talk about that a bit, and I talk about some examples of fakery in photography, things that are said to have been taken sometime, someplace, things that are passed off as actual things that happened when they were staged. There's that kind of stuff in it. But it just cemented in my head that there's no proof at all that photography was only invented in 1826 or 1827. I'm not sure when. But in my view, there's more evidence that it wasn't, that it's been around, as I say in my book, for a millennium. In fact, I don't actually say that. What I say is, history has been bastardized in its entirety for an eternity. Photography within this scattered history has too existed for a human eternity. And I think that's true. I think all the ingredients there to have had photography for thousands of years, the natural elements are there all the way along. They're never not there. Camera obscura, the Bitumen of Judea, and all the other wondrous stuff that humans have done over the thousands of years, maybe even further back, who knows. So that's kind of why I say history of photography is fake. And within all that, like I said earlier, it led me to conclude that academia wasn't worth its salt, because in getting my academic paper published, the things I had to leave out and omit from that to get it published, I feel were criminal, and it really grabbed my arse having to leave them out. The professor that helped me with it was great, and I understood his reasons for it, but how academia ever moves forward is beyond me, and how history in particular is ever accepted as a given is beyond me. We saw over the last 3 or 4 years, didn't we, that truth can be hidden as it happens. Mainstream news, politicians, all that is 99% fake, and it happens all the time, every day, as we live it. So you can only imagine the extent of what our history is fabricated to suit narratives. Can you imagine an actual photograph of President Lincoln's assassination? Or anything from history, the American Civil War, Norman conquest, Druids at Stone Age. Can you imagine photographs existing of any of that? Academia would never allow that to happen, even if they are there. I just use some quite out there examples, but it's perfectly acceptable, in my view, that photography is there and has been hidden. Can you imagine a bona fide picture of Jesus Christ? So they're the reasons why it's obfuscated. Many of them are many of the people that do it are not good people. They don't want good things for you and me. But hiding photography is one of the less evil things that happen in the world. So I hope that's given you some bones as to why I think the history of photography is fake. And please buy the book. It's only a tenner or so. Get it for a couple of quid on what's it called? Kindle. And if you drop me a nice email and tell me you'd like to read it, I might even sign one and send it to you. Always do that. I might even sign one and send it to you. Like I said, 130 pages. Probably take you a day or two to read it if you're slow like me. There's plenty of examples of what I did discovered in there. There's some quite bold statements, but there's probably as many questions as there are answers. And has my research stopped there? Probably not. I find it a bit difficult currently to write to that kind of volume, and I'm enjoying talking more just recently than I am writing. And like my lad Logan said to me, people sooner listen to you talk than read you write, which is probably true. So that was quite a fast, really, actually, kind of run through my version of the history of photography. I missed loads out, but then that'll make you have to go and read the book. And no, I can't do an audio book because you've heard me talk, haven't you? Imagine how many mistakes I would make and how many times I'd have to go back and edit that. That would take forever to get out. So please do buy the book. Like I said, it's only a tenner, a couple of quid if you get it on Kindle. In fact, if you've got that Kindle Pass thing, it's probably free, so you can probably read it for now. Probably let me know your thoughts. I'm always happy to hear your thoughts. And hopefully it might shed a bit of light on some other areas of life for you. Certainly, in terms of things aren't what you think they are, people aren't who you think they are, and situations were never what you thought they were. But certainly in my view, photography has been around forever and it's been hidden. And the more we can talk about that, the more truth we can understand, I think. So anyway, right, thanks for listening. I'm going to go, let you get back to your lives, and I'll catch you all soon. What's the next episode? I don't know. I'm not going to commit myself at this stage and wind up looking a fool. Cheers.